Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Center for a New American Security that last week launched a new study, A New American Way of War, very congruously branded as the person who's leading it would say, Chris Dougherty, one of the architects or one of the authors of the National Defense Strategy, terrific document. You're a senior fellow here. You guys had an event last week with none other than former Deputy Defense Secretary Bob Work, who also has a CNAS affiliation, and Dave Ochmanek, a longtime strategist. It's good that you had three strategists on the stage, including you, of course, of RAND. So tell us, Chris, a little bit of what you guys are trying to accomplish with this. I mean, I think that everybody looks at the way the entire U.S. military is postured and organized and wonders whether or not it's really matched to the kind of threats and challenges we face. Talk to us about what you're trying to accomplish, given that so many other folks are working this problem as well.
Absolutely, Vago. I think what we saw in the National Defense Strategy writ large, and you can see this in the diagnosis up in the very front of the unclassified summary, was that our conventional military advantage in the key theaters of operations, and namely East Asia and Eastern Europe, are eroding vis-a-vis China and Russia, respectively. And I think what we recognize is that it's not just going to be about buying new things. It's not just about the budget top line, even though I know that's on everybody's mind today with the budget rollout. But I think it's about how the joint force fights. And I think you can see fairly implicitly in the National Defense Strategy a critique of the way that we've been fighting for the last 30 years. What my colleague, and who is a fellow kind of NDS author, Elbridge Colby, would call the Gulf War model of American warfighting. I think what we've become accustomed to as a nation and as a military is fighting with an incredible amount of dominance, an incredible amount of sanctuary, both in the homeland, but all the way from the homeland up to the theater of operations. What we would call full spectrum dominance, information, air, maritime, and then the ability to fight and win wars at the time and place of our choosing. And I think when you look at the problems posed to us by China, and I think to a lesser extent Russia, those conditions don't really obtain anymore. And the way we've been fighting isn't going to work. And trying to make marginal improvements at the edges to try to, buy a slightly faster aircraft or buy a slightly better ship or a slightly better weapon isn't, when you add it all up, the sum total of it isn't going to get us to the outcome I think we as a nation probably deserve.
One of the area where so talk to us about the whole project, right? Because you're going to take the information piece of it. There are a couple of questions I want to ask you about that. And of course, Bridge Colby is here as one of the senior leadership team, and we've been lucky to talk to him a couple of times about strategy as well. Talk to us about how you guys have organized this, and what's the rollout plan as just give us the schedule and what are some of the big issues you guys will be wrestling with.
Yeah, absolutely. So the beginning part of it is going to be a foundational document that says, why does America need a new way of war, right? If we've been remarkably successful for the last 30 years, why go changing something that isn't broken? So first you have to tell people, here's why it's broken, at kind of a very high level so folks understand, okay, here's the problems that we're grappling with and sort of define the terms that we're dealing with. And then you break it down into its constituent parts because it's, as one of my colleagues who I talked to about this project said, that's a remarkably ambitious thing to do, right? You're talking about the entirety of how the joint force fights war. It's a very, very big topic. So probably not going to touch on every aspect of it, but you've got to break it down into the key components. And I think a few of the key components that you recognize when you are doing what former Secretary Work would call transoceanic power projection are information. So against all our adversaries we fought the last 30 years, we've had a remarkable advantageous asymmetry in information. So making sure that we have a sufficient advantage in that space against a competitor as capable as a Russia or a China is going to be difficult, and it's going to take thinking about things in a slightly different way than we have in the past. Logistics, I think when you're going to project power over many thousands of miles from the American homeland, you've got to have an ability to get forces to where they need to go, keep them fueled, keep them stocked with munitions, and then maintain that over time, which is remarkably difficult. Something the United States has done better than any other country, arguably in the history of the world, but that's something that's going to be increasingly contested as we look to potential conflicts in East Asia and Eastern Europe. And then I think the last bits of it, I think, are looking across the various domains that we fight in. So whether it's aerospace and whether you want to combine those two or separate them, which obviously gets into your thoughts on Space Force and other things, or other areas of dynamism within the defense space, our ability to gain and maintain maritime superiority, which is going to be key also to projecting power, obviously across oceans, because you're going to move large quantities of anything, you're going to do it across the oceans. So I think looking at each of these in turn and breaking it down into their constituent parts, but I think perhaps the thing I'm most interested in, it's fun to kind of grapple with these topics at an intellectual level, but the thing I'm most interested in is bringing together smart folks, and we're looking at slightly more junior people as part of this, with the idea being, it's consistent with the new American security, the idea here that we're futures and not formers, so what we want to have are some sort of junior 06s and below, that kind of age range of military strategists, operational thinkers, analysts, et cetera, and bring them together to grapple with these problems, and then send them out on their way to create a network so that we can start pushing for change inside the department. I don't think it's, I think if you watched the event that we had, Dave Ochmanek was totally right. The exact locus of information is not likely to be me. I'm a bearded former civilian from the Office of Secretary of Defense is what he called me. But I do think that we can bring together the smart folks from the services, which is really where military operational innovation does occur, bring them together, bring their thoughts together, work jointly so that we can come up with joint solutions to problems. And then, once we build the hypothesis here, they can take it back into the realm where they have all the classified material, classified analysis, and do the kind of hard work of taking it and building it into a proper concept.
And have you selected that? Is there a selection process? Is there an application process for you to harvest all of these young dynamic 06s that want to end their careers at 06?
So we have a
That was just a joke.
That's a fair point. So people can participate both on the record and off the record. So if people want to get their smart ideas out, but don't necessarily want to have their they don't want to be cut off at 06 or 05 or 06, they can absolutely participate anonymously. We do have a core group of folks. In large part, the beginnings of the network have been based on folks that we had known from the national defense strategies that were already plugged into the issues that we were dealing with, whether I know them through wargaming or analysis, et cetera. But the idea is to build that network out continually. So it's just there's a core group of folks, and then that's also going to spiral. So if there is a group of people that we need to tap into for information or for logistics or for air superiority or maritime superiority, we can tap that network and then build a group for that. And then within that space, we're going to do some workshops and wargaming of the concepts to kind of explore the problem space a little bit more before going into the research.
And of course, you have CNAS branded paper bags they can put over their heads when they come in here. Right. So it starts with looking at what you think does not now work. Right. So if you put on that list, we were talking a little bit about cyber. I think nobody is focused on cyber the way they should be focused on cyber because it is an operational realm. And frankly, if you're China, you want to win without fighting. Mm-hmm. And so there are a whole bunch of things you can do to undermine the United States. As we saw, Russia has very effectively managed to, because of Brexit, whether the U.S. election involvement, any number of things, has causes disruption, right, to divide your adversary, to occupy its bandwidth. So if you were looking at the long list of things, I mean, would it be because some of them are systems, right? I mean, as senior leaders spend a lot of time on the systems part of it to do the replacement for the next thing, as opposed to thinking, what is that leap ahead? Where do we need to be in this space? The aircraft carrier is a good example of, hey, has the Navy invested enough to make sure that it's irrelevant in a great power competition in a contested area? What are some of the systems, the assumptions, the thinking that you already going into this have identified as, hey, here are things and opportunities to think very differently compared to what we and how we operate and think now, and how we equip ourselves?
Absolutely. So I think the three things I would focus on, and we talked about this in the event on Thursday, are what a time, sanctuary, and dominance. These are three things that the United States military has enjoyed a fair amount of latitude in when they've been fighting folks like Iraq, right? So with time, it took a very, very long time. Even this is at the height of our kind of Cold War military defense posture in terms of sea lift and airlift. It took quite some time to build up the requisite forces in the Gulf in order to kind of do the rollback campaign against Hussein's Iraq. I don't think we'll have that 6 month of build-up time in in the event that there is a war with an opponent like a China or Russia, that's just not going to be the case. They are going to be able to move much more quickly, and I think they're going to be able to potentially establish facts on the ground and then threaten the use of strategic attacks or nuclear weapons or what have you to deter a massive U.S. counterattack like we would have seen in the Gulf War. So I think we have to figure out how do you deal with that time aspect of it. The sanctuary piece, I mean, if you look at, again, you go back to the Gulf War or the invasion of Iraq in 2003, Iraq had no meaningful ability to interdict U.S. forces outside of very, very close to Iraq, essentially, and even then, extremely inaccurate ballistic missiles that had some impacts, but didn't have a massive operational impact on the joint force. The difference, obviously, with China and Russia couldn't be more stark, right? They have an ability using ballistic and cruise missiles to attack air bases and ports and marshalling yards and road networks and bridges, et cetera, throughout their theaters of operation. But in addition to that, and I think this gets into your cyber piece, they can attack us in the homeland, and they can do it non-kinetically if they want to, which I think makes it very, very difficult for us when you're planning. I have a certain amount of time that I can get a force from one place to the next, and it's got to hit all these road junctures at certain points, and the rail has to all line up. And if you start fouling with that, even in a kind of very non-kinetic way, it can make it very, very difficult for us to meet our timelines to get where we need to go. And
so even subtle, right? It doesn't have to be a big attack. It just has to be delaying, and it's even hard for you to recognize, is that an attack? Is it, what is that?
Right. Is it just friction, or is this some friction that somebody put here in my way on purpose? And so I think not just thinking about that, but thinking about how you're going to respond to the fact that we no longer enjoy a sanctuary in the homeland for a variety of reasons, I think is going to be difficult for us as military planners to deal with, because it's simply not something we've really thought about very much for the last 30 years. And then the last bit is dominance. And I think there was a really astute question at our event on Thursday in which one of the questioners said, look, you're trying to get back to the level of dominance you had in the Cold War or the post-Cold War era, and I think the answer is no. And I think the reason for that is that it's unrealistic. We lived through this really, in many ways, fantastically anomalous period of history from 1989 to roughly 2014 or so. That's Bob Work's theory. It's 25 years from 1989 to 2014, and I think during that period we had this enormous military, but also technological, economic, political, cultural advantage over any potential competitor. And I think what you've seen is that just kind of across the board, all of those aspects of U.S. military power, not necessarily that they have decreased in an absolute sense, but that our relative advantage over someone like China has gone down quite a bit. And some of that has been decisions on our part, but a lot of that has simply been their sort of relentless focus on achieving critical benchmarks within those fields. And so I think you have to approach warfare from a very different position than you would if you were thinking about Saddam Hussein's Iraq, right, which doesn't have the economic ability, the diplomatic ability, the informational ability, all the other aspects of national power that they lack relative to the United States. It kind of just an enormous gap between the two makes the way that you conduct war different. And I think the project should understand that level of dominance, both in the warfighting domains where we kind of more traditionally think about it, but also more broadly, aren't going to obtain in this new way of war. And so you have to think about how you operate a little differently.
Do you need to be thinking about this, about how we think about war, or how we need to change how we think and look at it from the standpoint of Russians and Chinese? We do what we do because we think what we do is what it is we need to do, whether or not it moves any needle whatsoever on China and Russia. And it's abundantly clear that on some things we're doing it and they don't really care. In the case of the Chinese, they already know too much about how we operate, how we think. And I'm sure, as one friend of mine put it, it's remarkably relaxing for them because they're not going to be pressured on some of the things that they think they should be pressured on. How do we need to change how we and the whole national security apparatus and even defense strategists think about the problem that may not comport with our historical view of ourselves and how an enemy might fight?
I think so. I couldn't agree more with what you said. I think one of the things that made the national defense strategy different from the strategic reviews that came before it is I think not to critique all the defense reviews that came forward, but I do think that
they all sucked.
No,
They
no,
really.
I mean,
just
honestly,
kidding.
they were done. I mean, they were done under the conditions that obtained at that time, and I think the people who wrote them and did them did the best they could under the conditions they were working. I think you have to give a lot of credit to Secretary Mattis for one, for giving so much clear direction to the team. But two, I think it's a lot easier to do it in a classified document, that you can say things and you can think things that are difficult to do in an unclassified QDR. But what I will say is that we were a bit solipsistic, a bit self-centered in the post-Cold War era, in large part because we could be, because our advantage was so immense. That's where you get into these areas where it's the
Complacency. It was complacency.
Yeah, and the debate was, should we maintain this level of dominance, or should we have such an enormous level of dominance that nobody ever even thinks about competing with us? But those were the debates that were happening, and they made sense at the time. They don't make sense anymore. And so I think one of the things that we have to get to is to be much more competitor-focused and much more focused on how do our competitors and potential adversaries think about problems, and much less, here's the way I want to do business. Now let me think about how I do what I want to do better. And I think the old way of war was very much, and you see this in our doctrine and in our concepts and in what we buy and how we employ it, it's, I want to have air superiority, so an air superiority to me looks like a fighter that does X, Y, and Z, so I'm going to build another fighter that does X, Y, and Z, but with a plus 20% performance margin, and it's going to be better, and that's going to, I think we have to, that kind of way of thinking has to go away, and not that we shouldn't have fighter aircraft, and not that they shouldn't be great, but that the assumption that the way I do business works, and all I have to do is figure out how to turn the knob from 10 to 11 to 12 maybe, is probably not going to work. You have to think, does turn the knob to 12 actually make a difference for a potential adversary like China or Russia, or does it really not make a difference whatsoever, and they don't care because they're going to try to kill your aircraft on the ground? And if that's the case, then making an increasingly superior aircraft is probably not going to get us where we need to go if we can't figure out how to keep them safe on the ground, provide them with the information they need, and put enough munitions under the wings or in the kind of compartments to achieve the effects that we want to have. And so I think part of this project is to think a little bit more holistically about how we fight, and then work our way through the exact systems you might need, rather than, I think, the way the debate usually goes in this town, which is focused predominantly on the stuff we're going to buy, which is understandable, right? I mean, it's an enormous amount of taxpayer dollars, $750 billion if this budget goes through, and that's a lot of money. But I think the way to ensure that we use that money effectively is to ensure that how we fight actually works.
That's very astute, and I was kidding about that. A lot of very good strategy was produced, and I love the Spinal Tap reference, by the way. So well done.
Absolutely.
And the knob goes to 12.
Yes.
Boy, that's even better than the knob that goes to 11. When do you guys hope to have the project finished? And are you, do you wait till the end until you roll it out? Are you going to be rolling it out in pieces, each one of these tranches? How do you, what's the vision for this, so that for those who are trying to follow along at home?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first part is going to be a paper on why America needs a new way of war, as I mentioned, and that should be coming out within a month or two to lay out kind of the intellectual foundations of the project. And then the idea is once every couple months or so to roll out a smaller portion of the project, whether it's maintaining information advantage, conducting contested logistics, thinking about air operations in the future, whether we combine that with space or not, I think remains to be seen. Depends on analytically whether that's a tractable. Maritime operations of the future, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then, once you kind of add all those up, then bringing them together into a holistic, overarching concept. And I think, guessing probably more almost like a 2-year long project, but although it could depend, but it's not a small amount of thing that we're trying to tackle. So,
and tell us how this project cross-connects with what Susanna's were. I mean, you guys have a lot of very innovative projects that are actually cross-cutting. So tell us a little bit about how you're coordinating some of the great works, because there is some parallel elements here that go into a better whole.
Yes. So the defense team has kind of 3 projects. So we've got the overarching umbrella concept is called Sustaining America's Military Advantage, or SAMA for short, and that's Bridge Colby's project, which is a little bit higher level, focused on kind of the high military strategic, almost into the political military sphere of really the crux of defense strategy. Susanna's project focuses on taking a lot of those ends and turning them into means. One, through just analysis of the budget, but two, thinking about how do we reform the department to achieve what Acting Secretary Shanahan likes to call innovation at the speed of relevance. And I think her main project this year is focused on removing the obstacles to change and obstacles to innovation that the bureaucracy has kind of entrenched. And then my project likes to focus on the ways. So you see that kind of that tripartite ends, ways, mean relation. But that's not to say that we're not related with other aspects of the center. And one of the things that our new CEO, Richard Fontaine, as well as our Director of Studies, Eli Ratner, like to focus on the cross-cutting nature of our analysis and our work here at the center. And so, the work on China will obviously interrelate with the work that Dan Kleiman and the Asia team are doing. The work on Russia is obviously going to work with the Transatlantic Security Project and the fantastic work that Andrea Kendall-Taylor is doing. And then my piece, as well as Susanna's piece, are probably going to do a lot of work with Paul Shari and the Technology and National Security Project that we have here at the center. So everything kind of ties together with the hope of scoping out kind of a holistic vision for how the United States can, effectively not just compete in great power competitions, right? It's great to, we finally identified that we're in a competition. Now the question is, how do we win those competitions, right? It's not enough to just be in them. And I think that's what we're focused on here at the center.
And obviously a lot of beard quotient, right? I mean,
yes.
So you
have to.
There's a high
yes.
beard, right? And that's directly correlated to intellectual capacity, I think.
Totally. I mean, Thucydides had a beard, so QED.
Chris Dougherty, ending it on a rocking note. One of the architects of the National Defense Strategy, looking here at the Center for a New American Security to look at a new American way of war. Utterly fascinating. You guys do terrific work, and look forward to following it until the baby or the sausage is made.
Yes. All right. Thank you so much, Vago. Appreciate it.